The Progressive Era, beginning in the late 19th century to the 1920s, was a time of reform and expansion of democratic ideals throughout the nation. Multiple sects of citizens fought against unjust commercial practices, misrepresentation in the federal government, and for basic rights that are present in modern United States. One thing that heralded the Progressive Era was the entrance of the Populist Party into the political environment. The creation of the party was the result of years of discontent from the agrarian society of the nation. The farmers of the Midwest and South suffered under low prices for their goods in eastern markets, unjust commercial practices from monopolies such as the railroading industry, and the rising debt among the entire community. The party spawned from organizations like the Southern Farmers Alliance and the Knights of Labor, headed by Terence Powderly. The party made its formal entrance into the presidential race at a convention in Omaha, Nebraska, where they also released their party platform, conveniently coined the Omaha Platform. This platform called for the implementation of a secret ballot, public referendum and initiative, the direct election of senators, government ownership of railroads and telecommunications, national banking reform, the creation of a graduated income tax, coinage of silver or bimetallism, an 8-hour workday, and the creation of a sub-treasury for farm goods and money set aside for farming subsidies. The party's general makeup was congruent with that of others, so they had to fight against democratically entrenched Southwest, Great Plains, and Southern states for support, as well as many traditionally Republican states. The Populist Party also pulled support from the Prohibition movement as well as the lower class, seeking to incorporate women, but there were also disagreements with the role of African Americans in the party. There were several members of the party in high positions that were self-declared white supremacists, causing some division in the party. Since the party was unable to generate a strong presidential candidate, most of the party threw their support to the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan. This transition was smooth due to Bryan's support of bimetallism and his opposition to the unfair distribution of wealth and power in the country, both seen in his Cross of Gold speech. When Bryan lost the general election in 1896 as well as in 1900, the Populist Party seemed to fade away. Most of the party members either joined the Democratic Party, followed Eugene Debs and his Socialist Party, or left the political world altogether. However, a majority of the party's platform was picked up by other major parties, which found its way into legislation throughout the 20th century. Outside the Populist Party, the agrarian movement brought about reform throughout the nation. The Grange was founded by Oliver Hudson Kelley in 1867 to unite farming communities spread throughout the country to form a national community. The Grange fought for fair treatment of small farmers, mainly against the gross costs of shipping by railroad, the management of grain houses, and the creation of consumer cooperatives. They created the Rural Free Delivery System to deliver mail to rural communities, and the Farm Credit System to provide assistance to all types of farmers. In Munn v. Illinois, grain houses were ruled to be regulated by public law, allowing for the passage of Granger laws, which also affected the railroading industry. The case and preceding laws were one of the Grange's greatest victories, however, it was later overturned by the Supreme Court in Wabash v. Illinois. However, the case led to the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act, which allowed for the federal regulation of business. Grangers found their ideals being implanted in legislation such as the Bland-Allison Act, which was the push for silver to be incorporated in national currency, and the Federal Farm Loan Act, which provided credit for farmers. Legislation like the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 helped defend the farming community against unfair policies of railroading by creating a commission which held authority over the industry. Another area of social reform was women's rights and the push for women's suffrage. The National Women's Party, founded by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, fought for this right to be solidified by a constitutional amendment. Originally named the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1913, the organization split 3 years later into the National Women's Party and another organization due to differing ideas on how to secure women's suffrage. From picketing in front of the White House to hunger strikes, the efforts of these women helped secure the implementation of the 19th Amendment. After the passage of the amendment, the organization pushed for an Equal Rights Amendment, which would eliminate all forms of gender discrimination. It was on a path of ratification until conservative Phyllis Schlafly led a coalition against the amendment, identifying its underlying implications, such as the loss of exemption under Selective Service registration. The NWP's ideals eventually found its way into legislation through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Other organizations such as the National American Women's Suffrage Organization and the League of Women Voters also headed movements for women's suffrage and equality. Women were also involved in the Populist Party, the Grange, and the temperance movement. Although African Americans were liberated from slavery and secured their right to vote, they still faced immense opposition and discrimination. Jim Crow laws, following black codes that were implemented before the Civil War, were laws designed to discriminate and segregate African Americans, and were prevalent in southern states. African Americans had a continued battle against disenfranchisement, and had to endure literacy tests, poll taxes, white primaries, and the grandfather clause, which practically stripped them of their right to vote. These trials led to the emergence of great civil rights activists seeking equality. Booker T. Washington, a prevalent African American leader at the time, advocated long-term educational and economic advancement of the black community rather than a direct confrontation, a message he delivered in his Atlanta Compromise. He asserted that proving the community as a valuable entity in the United States society would eventually secure them equality. Leaders of the Niagara movement like W.E.B. Du Bois opposed this mentality and sought the immediate implementation of civil rights and better political representation, which he believed would be secured by the elite members of the African American community, which he coined the Touted Tenth. He was also one of the founding members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. On the other end of the spectrum, there is Marcus Garvey, who led the Back to Africa movement, which asserted that global African American communities around the world should return to their ancestral lands. The movement for social equality also found a foothold in journalism in the form of Ida B. Wells, who wrote about the injustice being practiced in the South in the form of lynchings and other abuses. The movement paved the way for future leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., which accumulated into the passage of the Civil Rights Act. The temperance movement also caught hold during the Progressive era. The most notable figure of this movement is Carrie Nation, who was known to storm into bars to use force to support her cause. She was infamous for kicking and breaking bottles of alcoholic beverages while wielding a hatchet. The movement accumulated into the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which ushered in the Prohibition era. However, the act only pushed the national community into crimes such as bootlegging, which was prevalent throughout the nation. The creation of speakeasies and blind pigs, establishments that illegally sell alcoholic beverages, became a common sight in urban areas where people flocked to get their hands on the good stuff. The dramatic increase in crime led the government to later revoke the two pieces of legislation with the 21st Constitutional Amendment. One of the greatest battles of the time was the middle working class versus robber barons. These were individuals who owned monopolies in one of America's growing industries. The most notable were Carnegie and U.S. Steel, Rockefeller with Standard Oil, J.P. Morgan with corporate financing, and Vanderbilt in the railroading industry. These individuals were claimed to have essentially bought out Congress to ensure their commercial prowess, leading to the Senate's nickname, the Millionaires' Club. However, the federal government also took measures to break up these monopolies and defend the working man. Organizations such as the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor sought to unite communities of middle-class workers to defend against unjust working conditions and policies against their corporate enemy. The idea of muckrakers came about due to the grossly unregulated working conditions and general crimes against the public by corporate bodies or local authority. Jacob Riis depicted a shocking lifestyle of living in tenements in poor parts of urban cities through the use of photography. Ida Tarbell, who wrote the history of Standard Oil Company, helped bring down the monopoly due to her insight of Rockefeller's nature and beliefs. Upton Sinclair railed against the lack of regulation in the meatpacking industry in his book The Jungle, where he highlighted the awful conditions advocated as permissible in the industry. Thomas Nast, a cartoonist, used his journalism and cartoons to identify the injustice of Boss Tweed and his political machine, Tammany Hall, and essentially brought the entire operation to a halt with the incarceration of Tweed. Theodore Roosevelt is considered the first major progressive president. His domestic plan, Square Deal, focused on the conservation of natural resources, the regulation of large corporations, and the protection of consumers. He became known as an effective trust buster, utilizing the previously dormant Sherman Antitrust Act to dispel monopolies that were harming the economy. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act were also passed during his administration, protecting consumers against unregulated food and mislabeled drugs for medicinal purposes. The Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act both bolster the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the former allowing the commission to heavily fine railroading corporations who gave rebates, and the latter which allowed the commission to set maximum railroad rates. William Howard Taft was known as the trustbuster of the era, much more than was Roosevelt, dissipating over twice as many monopolies. He was handpicked by Roosevelt to follow after his administration and supported the Square Deal, and was anticipated to be an effective progressive president. However, Despite success in regulating monopolies, he got caught in political controversy, which made him ineffective. His negligence toward Secretary of State Richard Ballinger's private dealings, as well as his opposition towards Gifford Pinchot, alienated him from progressives. This affair, along with his lack of support in the Payne-Aldrich Act, which would lower tariffs on certain goods, enraged Roosevelt and progressives. Roosevelt even ran against him in the next election due to his disappointment, running as a candidate for his self-created Bull Moose Party. The division of the Republican Party between the candidates allowed for the election of Woodrow Wilson to the presidency. Woodrow Wilson was the first Democratic president since the Civil War. He pushed through Congress the Underwood-Simmons tariff, which lowered the obscenely high rates from the McKinley tariff. He then tackled the banking system by creating the Federal Reserve System, where reserve banks were created in 12 regions around the country, providing oversight over the local banks in the region. The Federal Reserve Board was also created to set interest rates of loans to member banks. He bolstered already existing antitrust policies by passing the Federal Trade Commission and the Clayton Antitrust Act, which battled against unfair policies in major corporations which would hinder competition.